Welcome to Unlimited Horror Stories, the channel where we bring you the most chilling tales of terror from across the world. In this video, we bring you a spine-tingling horror story about a woman who inherits a strange house from a dead man she never met, only to find herself trapped in a nightmarish netherworld. Join us as we take you on a journey through a twisted reality, where nothing is as it seems and danger lurks around every corner. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel to support us in bringing you more terrifying tales like this one. Let's dive into the nightmare inheritance, trapped in a twisted reality. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, and the woman's heart skipped a beat as she read the words scrawled across the page. "My dearest Clara," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to you from beyond the grave, as it were, to inform you that I have left you something in my will." Clara had never met the man who wrote the letter. He was a distant cousin of her mother's, someone who had never figured prominently in her family's life. And yet he had left her something that made her heart race with anticipation and fear. She read on, her fingers trembling slightly. "I have left you my house, my dear, a little place on the outskirts of town. It's not much, but I hope it will be enough to give you a fresh start. You'll find the key enclosed with this letter. Use it wisely, my dear." Clara stared at the key, feeling a sense of unease creep over her. She had always been a practical person, someone who believed in making her own way in the world. She had a good job, a small apartment, and a few close friends. She didn't need a house, certainly not one that belonged to a dead man she had never met. But as she read through the rest of the letter, she began to feel a strange pull towards the house. The man wrote about it with such fondness, describing its quirks and its history in such vivid detail that Clara could almost picture it in her mind's eye. She decided to visit the house, just to see what it was like. She drove out to the outskirts of town, passing through winding country roads and fields of tall grass. The rain had stopped by the time she arrived, but the air was still damp and chill. The house was a small, squat building made of red brick and surrounded by a small garden. It looked old, but well-maintained, with a certain charm that Clara couldn't quite put her finger on. She walked around it, feeling a sense of nostalgia wash over her. It reminded her of the houses she used to draw as a child, with sloping roofs and little chimneys. As she approached the front door, she hesitated for a moment. What was she doing here, really? She didn't know anything about the man who had left her the house, and she had no idea what to expect inside. But the key was burning a hole in her pocket, and the curiosity was too strong to resist. She slid it into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. The inside of the house was dark, the curtains drawn shut, and the only light coming from a few flickering candles. Clara stepped inside, feeling a sense of unease settle over her once again. It was too quiet, too still. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. There was no response, only the sound of her own breathing and the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. She walked through the house slowly, taking in each room with a sense of wonder and apprehension. There was a kitchen with a worn wooden table, a sitting room with a fireplace, and a few dusty armchairs, a bedroom with a narrow bed and a small closet. But it was the room at the back of the house that caught her attention, the one with a heavy wooden door and a rusty lock. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Clara frowned, feeling a sense of frustration grow within her. She didn't like the idea of something being locked away from her, especially in a house that was now hers. The next day, Clara decided to go back to the house. She couldn't stop thinking about the locked room at the back of the house, and the feeling of unease it had given her. As she drove out to the outskirts of town, she noticed that the sky was overcast and gray. The air felt heavy and humid, like a storm was brewing just over the horizon. When she arrived at the house, she found that the front door was already open. She hadn't left it that way, had she? She shrugged off the thought and stepped inside. The house felt different today, somehow. The air was thicker, and the rooms seemed to twist and turn in on themselves. Clara felt a sense of disorientation as she walked through the house, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She made her way to the locked room at the back of the house. The door was still locked, but she could hear a faint whispering coming from the other side. She pressed her ear against the wood, trying to make out what was being said. It was a strange, guttural language, one she had never heard before. The voice was low and growling, and it seemed to be coming from all around her, as if it was inside her own head. Clara took a step back, feeling a sense of terror grip her. She wanted to leave the house, to run back to her car, and drive away as fast as she could. But something was holding her there, something she couldn't quite explain. She turned around, trying to find a way out, but the hallway was gone, replaced by a twisting, turning maze of shadows and whispers. She stumbled forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls seemed to shift and change around her, like living things. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Clara could feel something reaching out to her from the darkness, something cold and hungry. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of sound. The walls closed in on her, suffocating her, until she was nothing but a tiny, insignificant thing in the vastness of the netherworld. And then she was falling through a void of darkness and terror. She screamed and flailed, trying to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing. The void seemed to stretch on forever, a bottomless pit of fear and despair. At last, she landed with a sickening thud on a hard surface. She looked up and saw that she was in a strange, twisted landscape, filled with grotesque shapes and writhing masses of flesh. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped in this nightmarish netherworld, with no way out. Clara lay on the hard, twisted ground, her mind reeling from the shock of what had just happened. She had fallen into some kind of nightmare realm, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. As she looked around, she saw that the landscape was like nothing she had ever seen before. The sky was a sickly shade of green, and the ground was covered in pulsating masses of flesh that seemed to writhe and twist beneath her feet. She got to her feet, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She needed to find a way out of this place, to get back to the real world, and escape the horrors that lurked in this nightmarish netherworld. She took a step forward and felt a sickening squish beneath her foot. Looking down, she saw that she had stepped on one of the writhing masses of flesh. It seemed to be alive, pulsating with a sickly green light. Clara shuddered and stepped back, trying to find a path through this twisted landscape. As she walked, she heard strange noises in the distance, moans and whispers, like the sounds of tortured souls. She pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find a way out of this place, before it was too late. As she walked, she saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothing, his face twisted in pain and despair. "Please," he whispered, reaching out to her. "Help me." Clara hesitated, unsure if she could trust this man, but she couldn't leave him here to suffer in this place. She approached him cautiously, keeping her guard up. As she got closer, she saw that he was covered in strange, writhing tendrils of flesh. "Please," he begged again, "get them off of me." Clara hesitated, unsure of what to do. She had no idea how to help this man, and she didn't want to get too close to those writhing tendrils. But as she watched, the tendrils began to grow, wrapping themselves around the man's body. He screamed in agony, thrashing wildly. Clara knew she had to act fast. She reached out and grabbed hold of one of the tendrils, pulling with all her strength. It felt like pulling on a rubber band, but she managed to tear it away from the man's body. The man gasped in relief, the tendrils falling away from him. He stood up, shaking and weak. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I thought I was going to die here." Clara nodded, still feeling uneasy. She didn't know who this man was, or what had happened to him. "We need to find a way out of here," she said, looking around at the twisted landscape. The man nodded, and together they began to search for a way out. They walked for what felt like hours, encountering more and more twisted horrors along the way. But at last, They saw a faint light in the distance. It was a tiny pinprick of hope, a way out of this nightmarish realm. They ran towards the light, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they got closer, they saw that it was a small portal, shimmering in the distance. Clara took a deep breath and stepped through the portal, praying that it would take her back to the real world. And with a blinding flash of light, she was gone. Clara stumbled through the portal, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. She had no idea what had just happened to her, but she knew that she never wanted to experience anything like it again. As she looked around, she realized that she was back in the strange house that she had inherited from the dead man. She had hoped that the portal would take her back to the real world, but it seemed that she was still trapped in this nightmare. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down. She needed to find a way out of this house, to escape the horrors that lurked within its walls. As she walked through the house, she began to notice strange markings on the walls and floors. They were symbols that she had never seen before, etched into the very fabric of the house itself. She wondered what they could mean, and why the dead man had left them there. She had always thought that the man had been a recluse, but now she realized that he must have been involved in something far more sinister. As she continued to explore the house, she stumbled upon a hidden room. It was small and cramped, filled with strange artifacts and dusty books. Clara began to read through the books, trying to make sense of the strange symbols and rituals that they described. She realized that the dead man had been involved in some kind of dark magic, using the house as a conduit for his twisted experiments. But why had he left the house to her? Clara wondered. Was he trying to pass on his legacy, or was he simply trying to trap her in this nightmare realm? She had to find answers, and she knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed to reach out to someone who could help her make sense of the madness that she had stumbled into. As she reached for her phone, she realized that she had no signal. She was cut off from the outside world, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. But then she remembered the man she had met in the nightmare realm. He had been trapped there too, just like her. Maybe he could help her uncover the truth about this house and the dead man who had left it to her. Clara made her way back to the portal, hoping that she could find her way back to the nightmare realm. She took a deep breath and stepped through the portal, praying that she would find the man on the other side. And to her relief, he was there, waiting for her. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse, "I knew you would come back." "Who are you?" Clara asked, still unsure if she could trust him. "My name is Jacob," he said. "I've been trapped here for as long as I can remember. The dead man, he brought me here, just like he did to you." Clara nodded, feeling a sense of relief. She wasn't alone in this nightmare anymore. Together, Clara and Jacob began to explore the twisted landscape of the nightmare realm, searching for answers to the questions that had brought them there. As they walked, Clara realized that she was starting to trust Jacob. He seemed to know more about this nightmare realm than she did, and he was willing to help her uncover the truth. And as they delved deeper into the nightmare realm, Clara began to realize that there was far more at stake than just her own survival. The dead man had been involved in something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined, and if they didn't stop him, he could wreak havoc on the entire world. Clara and Jacob continued to explore the nightmare realm, searching for clues about the dead man and his twisted experiments. As they walked, they noticed that the world around them was changing, becoming darker and more twisted with every step. They eventually arrived at a large, imposing castle, which Clara immediately recognized as the dead man's stronghold. It was the source of the nightmare realm's darkness, and they knew that they had to confront the dead man if they had any hope of escaping this nightmare. As they made their way through the castle's winding halls, they encountered all manner of twisted creatures and horrors, each one more terrifying than the last. Clara's heart was pounding in her chest, and she felt like she was on the verge of breaking down. But she knew that she had to stay strong, for Jacob's sake as well as her own. She couldn't let the dead man win. Finally, they'd reached the throne room, where the dead man sat on his throne, surrounded by his twisted creations. He was a gaunt, pale figure, with eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. "So, you've finally come," he said, his voice raspy and hollow. Clara stepped forward, her eyes locked on the dead man. "Why did you leave this house to me?" she demanded. "What is all of this?" The dead man smiled, a cold, cruel expression. "I left it to you because I knew that you were the only one who could continue my work," he said. "The work of creating a new world, one where I can reign supreme." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. The dead man's words were filled with madness and delusion, but there was a strange logic to them. He truly believed that he was creating a better world, one where he was the ruler. But Clara knew that she couldn't let that happen. She had to stop him, no matter what the cost. She drew her weapon, a simple blade that she had found in the nightmare realm, and charged at the dead man. Jacob followed closely behind, wielding a staff that crackled with dark energy. The battle was intense and brutal, with both sides unleashing all manner of spells and attacks. Clara felt like she was fighting for her life, but she refused to back down. Finally, after what felt like hours of fighting, Clara landed the killing blow. The dead man's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless and still. Clara and Jacob looked at each other, both of them exhausted and relieved. They had finally defeated the dead man and escaped the nightmare realm. As they made their way back to the portal, Clara realized that she had learned a valuable lesson. The world was full of darkness and horror, but it was also full of hope and light. As long as she had people like Jacob by her side, she knew that she could face anything that the world threw at her. Clara and Jacob stumbled out of the portal, their bodies battered and bruised from their ordeal in the nightmare realm. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath and taking in their surroundings. They were back in the real world, in front of the strange house that Clara had inherited from the dead man. But everything looked different now. The house seemed to be less foreboding, and the surrounding trees were greener and more vibrant. Clara and Jacob slowly stood up, and Jacob turned to Clara with a worried expression on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked. Clara nodded, her eyes still fixed on the house. "I think so," she said. "But what about you?" Jacob shrugged. "I'll be fine," he said. "But we need to figure out what to do next. We can't just leave this house here." Clara knew he was right. They couldn't leave the house standing as a monument to the dead man's madness. They had to do something about it. Together, they walked back into the house, taking in the changes that had taken place. The once dark interior was now filled with sunlight, and the rooms seemed less oppressive. As they explored the house, they found a room that had been locked before, and it was now open. Inside, they found a journal, filled with the dead man's musings and experiments. Clara read through the journal with a mixture of horror and fascination, trying to understand the dead man's twisted mind. She learned that the dead man had been obsessed with the idea of creating a new world, one where he could reign supreme. He had experimented with all manner of dark magic, using the nightmare realm as his laboratory. But there were also hints of regret and sadness in the journal, as if the dead man had realized the error of his ways too late. Clara felt a pang of sympathy for the dead man, but she knew that he had gone too far. His experiments had caused too much pain and suffering, and she couldn't forgive him for that. As they continued to explore the house, they found a room filled with strange, glowing crystals. Clara realized that these were the source of the nightmare realm's power, and she knew that they had to be destroyed. She and Jacob spent the next few days smashing the crystals and destroying the dead man's experiments, leaving the house a mere shell of what it had once been. When they were done, Clara and Jacob stood in front of the house, watching as it crumbled to the ground. It was a bittersweet moment, as they had destroyed the dead man's legacy, but they had also put an end to the horror that he had unleashed. As they walked away from the ruins, Clara turned to Jacob. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Jacob smiled. "You don't have to thank me," he said. We did this together, and I'll always be here for you, no matter what. Clara felt a warmth in her chest, knowing that she had someone like Jacob in her life. She knew that the world was still full of darkness and horror, but as long as she had people like him by her side, she could face anything.